Hi, thank you both for being here. So, first off, just to kind of contextualize this, Bao, maybe you can talk a bit about your relationship to Bruce Lee and his work, and sort of when you first took notice of him as a star and as somebody worthy of a deeper look.
Well, for me, I mean, I grew up after Bruce Lee had passed away, and so I wasn't watching the films in the cinema like many people who admire him did. I remember just seeing him on Saturday afternoon television, where there was like a kung fu or a martial arts hour, and not knowing exactly what I was seeing, because for the longest time I wasn't used to seeing people who look like me as an Asian American male play a hero, play the lead in their story. So when I saw Enter the Dragon, it was really awe-inspiring to me just to see, again, someone who looked like me relatively play such a heroic role and play a role that wasn't, different from the Long Duc Dungs or, Short Round in Indiana Jones, always kind of the sidekick, never the hero. And for the longest time, Bruce Lee, because of this image that I had of him, he became a symbol for me, a symbol of representation, a symbol of confidence, especially Asian American male confidence. But I felt for the longest time I never knew who he was as a person. As you were saying, I think he's become this cultural icon, this film icon, but we never understood all the struggles and past and difficulties that he went through as a person, especially as a actor of color in 1960s Hollywood, which certainly is difficult today, but to sort of try to make it in the 1960s was a path and journey that I really wanted to explore through this film.
And so what was the starting point for you in terms of making this, from being somebody who invested in Bruce Lee's story to realizing that this would be your next project?
For me, I mean, so my first film was called Live from New York Riots, like looking at Saturday Night Live through a different lens, an anthropological lens, like I would say. And these are big, obviously, cultural institutions, American institutions, and people might think that there's been enough stories told about them. But, again, as an Asian American filmmaker and as a child of immigrants, child of refugees who considers himself very much American now, I always wanted to look at these different institutions with a slightly different tint, I would say, a different perspective than what you've seen them in. And I think, this year, especially 2020, is reckoning of the past and reckoning of institutions. I think for ourselves as filmmakers, we can look at how we can reframe narratives and mythologies and institutions in a way that feel a bit personal and more honest to ourselves. And Bruce Lee was one of these people. There's been many Bruce Lee documentaries since he passed away 40 years ago. But what we found, Julie and I found out, that there hasn't been a documentary that was made by a feature documentary that was made by an Asian American. And so I wanted to make sure that Bruce Lee's story wasn't just sort of lens in the view of, again, a cultural icon, but as an Asian American icon, as an Asian American. And I think that story has been lost in his sort of narrative over time. And that really propelled me towards making this film. And as you said too, like knowing Bruce Lee as a human being, really humanizing the myth of Bruce Lee.
So Julia, what was your entry point to this project?
Bao and I had known each other for quite some time. I was a fan of his first film, and we had been talking about Bruce Lee and, a film or a feature doc around him. And it was really when Bao came to me and spoke to me about, I suppose, how we could how he wanted to make the film more personal, and how this was his version of a Bruce Lee film. And that really fascinated me, that whole idea of, I just thought, Bruce Lee was a martial artist who did make it in Hollywood, because I only had the back catalogue to watch. And, this is slightly gender stereotyped, but I learned everything about Bruce Lee through my brother, who was a huge fan, and just osmosis of him watching. And, so when Bao came to me with the idea, it felt so much more intimate. The historical and cultural context that he was pitching with it was, things I'd never heard. And I just felt the meeting of those worlds in terms of, you know, Bruce Lee's journey, Bao's personal, you know, kind of journey as an Asian American, the history he knew, the culture he knew, you know, all of that coming together was a really exciting proposition. I mean, it was very, very hard film to make, as he knows, because it took many years, you know, for us to get the right access and the right permissions with everyone from kind of Warner Brothers to, you know, the family.
Well, yeah, let's talk more about that. At what point did you start to realize just how challenging this was going to be? I mean, what sort of access from the get-go did you know you needed in order to tell this story?
Well, yeah, touching upon what Julia said, I think it wasn't just the access, but also Bruce Lee having passed away at such a young age. There wasn't that trove of archive that you would expect from someone who's such a cultural icon, right? I knew that there was only one English language interview, the Pierre Burton interview, that is pretty much the main kind of source of the film that existed. And that, you know, that tape was found in the 90s. And I was hoping in the span of the 5 years that we were making the film that we'd have some sort of, you know, discovery of archival, and unfortunately we didn't. So that was trying to, you know, use Bruce Lee's voice as much as possible to tell the story, but knowing that there's only a 25-minute interview that we can use was definitely difficult. And also, as you were saying, getting the permission of the family. And I always wanted to make a film that wasn't necessarily, you know, produced by the family, and they didn't produce the film at all, but I wanted to pay respects to the family, because obviously if you're going to tell an intimate story of a person, you want to talk to his daughter and his widow and the people who knew him closely. And that meant creating relationships. And I never wanted to think of my relationship with the family as being transactional. It was something that was built over time, that started 5 years ago, really. And it took a lot of phone calls for them to even talk to me. As you can imagine, there's many people who want to make a film about Bruce Lee that are constantly pitching the family a film about Bruce Lee. And I had to come in with that very specific angle and perspective of being an Asian American and wanting to tell it through that lens, because it was something that I felt like I could only tell, again, as an Asian American filmmaker and as a special connection to Bruce Lee in that way. So it wasn't until like a couple years ago that Shannon, his daughter, who is also sort of looks after his estate and the archive, she agreed to kind of give us access to the archive, and that helped shape the story in many ways. But it should be said that, yeah, the family didn't see the cut of the film until a week before it broadcast on ESPN. And again, I think that was because I was able to build this trust within the family. And I think that was definitely the most difficult thing for me, was just to know that, you know, you want to make a story that feels authentic and honest. And that meant, again, having the respect, you know, paying respect to the family and their story, right? Because as much as we want to take ownership of Bruce Lee again, I keep on calling him an icon, but he, you know, certainly was. He was a human being, he was a friend, he was a father, he was a brother, he was a husband. And to everyone who I talked to, which, you know, 95% of the film are people who knew Bruce Lee intimately, it was just Bruce to them. He wasn't Bruce Lee. And so that meant, again, building trust, building relationships with all the people that we spoke to. So the stories that we got were authentic, that were personal.
So Julia, from a producing standpoint, to go back to something you were saying earlier, what sort of practical challenges did you sort of have to go through in terms of getting the permission that was necessary just to proceed with the project from the get-go?
Yeah, I mean, it was really, really challenging. And I think especially because I hadn't made an archive film per se before. Also, you know, and films change all the time as filmmakers find their vision. But we didn't actually think this was potentially going to be 100% archive when we started. And so definitely the budget didn't necessarily reflect like 100% archive and things like that. So for me, like, you know, the challenges of, you know, getting some of the world's like biggest, well, you know, Bruce Lee's biggest movies that are owned by the biggest studios in the world, you know, was really hard. You know, we are a relatively small documentary. We were very lucky that we had permission of the Bruce Lee estate to use his image, so that really helped us kind of jump the queue. But you know, it was still you know, really tough. But you know, we had a great archive team. We ended up actually splitting the archive, and we had an archivist in the US, and then we had an archivist in Hong Kong. And it was amazing actually for me and for the whole team. We spent some time in Hong Kong, and you know, we uncovered, even though, you know, obviously there's nothing that is, you know, exclusive, I suppose, we did uncover some real gems that, you know, was kind of sitting, there's a Bruce Lee museum in Hong Kong. And so we were lucky enough to go there, and, you know, it's such a treasure trove, and that was, you know, really incredible. But I think the kind of the very sensitive nature of getting all these permissions, because, you know, there's all the third party that are, you know, all the third party actors and stuff that are in there. But, you know, we did it, and it really helped us, you know, when we got accepted to Sundance, because the minute you kind of, you know, and this is kind of how hairy it was, you know, even in the week running up to Sundance, you know, we're still trying to get permissions, we're still trying to clear archive. But, you know, we did it. And yeah, you know, it's out there in the world. So
I should just, sorry to interrupt real quick. I want to give credit where credit's due with Julia, especially with trying to make the film all archival, because originally, you know, we shot all the interviews, and Julia would constantly
in 4K.
Yes. And she would always ask me, oh, like, what's the percentage of the film that's archival, interview, you know, shot footage, things like that. And I knew from the beginning that it was going to be all archival. I didn't necessarily tell Julia that. But the numbers slowly, like, it would be like, oh, it's like 50% archival. And then like 2 months later, I'd be like, it's 70% archival. And then by the end, it's 100% archival. So, and Julia was always very supportive as a producer, knowing that whatever way I wanted to tell the story, but obviously from a producer standpoint, she had to think about the budget quite a lot.
But I do think, just also in support of Bao, you know, I think it was so, you know, Bruce Lee died so young, and I suppose it became very clear that a lot of his contemporaries that are living today are, you know, in their 80s. And actually, we wanted to give the film not a timeless feeling, but definitely a sense of, you know, that he was early 30s. And I think because you don't see those faces, I hope, you know, you get it feels of that time, I suppose. And you know, I suppose the pain and the kind of, yeah, the shame of it all in terms of his early death, you really feel because of that.
Well, it's fascinating also to hear that there are 4K interviews with these people sitting on a hard drive somewhere, because I'm sure that would have been a very different kind of movie to be a parade of talking heads, as opposed to, you know, the way we're sort of in the moment in this film, but also hearing these voices. And I thought it'd be worth drilling into one voice we hear quite a bit throughout the movie, and that's Shannon's. And I'd love to hear from you, Bao, about how you sort of landed on her as this key voice throughout the movie, and, you know, what the process was like in terms of interviewing somebody like this who's got so much that she sort of lived through in terms of her father's legacy.
Well, we knew that we wanted to really include Bruce's writings throughout the film because he was such a prolific writer, and that was a way to give him a voice, right? To give him a bit more personality, a bit more character, without having, sadly that he's not alive to speak for himself. And we went back and forth a lot about who would read these writings. And, you know, it went from like, oh, we'll hire an actor like a Henry Golding, or someone who can sort of speak to the struggles of being an Asian American actor, or maybe have a whole sort of cast of different people who can speak to it. It was a discussion with our editor Graham, Julie, and I, and Shannon, who has really been immersed in her father's story and her father's writings for so long, came up, and she was obviously one of the top choices, but she's really one of the only people in the world, or, you know, sadly, because Brandon, her brother, Bruce's son, passed away tragically, who literally has Bruce Lee's DNA in her still, right? And there's something to be said about that. There's, you know, something that's unspoken that we can't express, that no actor could express. And I think we want it to feel genuine as much as possible. And I think Shannon does that really beautifully. And I mean, obviously there was some pushback, the idea of having a woman read for Bruce Lee and making it feel jarring. But I think in a way she's reading the letters and the writings like she has just discovered them. It's somewhat of a moment that is placed in the present, but it's also kind of placed in the past, right? And I was pretty adamant that there was a line at the end of the film where, you know, Bruce Lee has passed away, and she talks about finding these letters and how she found solace in reading them, especially after her brother died. And I think that was a way to tie in the sort of device of her reading it throughout the film. Because it even though we, as much as possible, through not showing the interviews, the present day interviews, and only showing archival, those moments where she's reading the letter is sort of our entry point into the present day in some ways.
The other thing I think is kind of fascinating about the way the film is structured is that it doubles as this kind of film essay of sorts on American media and the role that it played in perpetuating stereotypes about Asians that kind of calcified in popular culture. And that it gives you a real direct sense of what Bruce Lee had to push back against. And that's a very ambitious kind of big picture sort of thing to put into a movie that's, you know, sort of about one particular subject. So can you talk a bit more about, you know, how much of that you wanted to make sure to address directly in the film without, you know, taking away from the Bruce Lee of it all?
I mean, for me, that was one of the main, like, that was the thesis of the film, right? Like Bruce Lee as someone who's being deprived, as an Asian American who's deprived of sort of his totality, because, you know, it should be said that he didn't become famous until after he died, at least in America in many ways, because he was denied sort of that lead role in Kung Fu. And that's, for me, that's how I tried to make the film personal, even though my voice is not in the film. I'm not related to Bruce Lee in any way. But I'm always reminded of this line that this writer, the author, Junot Diaz, says, where, you know, there's an idea that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. So if you want to make a human being a monster, you deny them at a cultural level a reflection of themselves. And I always carry that with me whenever I'm making something, and especially with this film, where I think Bruce Lee, without him being sort of this Asian American icon, this hero for generations, for, you know, especially my generation, then Asian Americans, their representation would not, it would be even further back than it is today. So it's important for us to remember how Bruce Lee got to where he was, and like all the obstacles and challenges that he faced. I mean, one thing that is kind of a sad point of Bruce Lee's life is that he was watching all these depictions of Asian Americans on screen, and he never had this desire to become an actor, even though he was very prolific when he was a young child in Hong Kong. He was in many films, basically the Macaulay Culkin of Hong Kong when he was younger. He didn't think that Hollywood America would have accepted an Asian as a lead, as a hero in his time, right? So that's why he never pursued it. It was just this random event where Jay Sebring saw him at this tournament in Long Beach that propelled him and motivated him to pursue acting again. So it just goes to show that how important representation is, that even someone like Bruce Lee, who has this charisma, has this stage presence, like he didn't think that he would make it in Hollywood because there weren't examples, there weren't reflections, to go back to the Junot Diaz line, of himself. And I think we're still having that conversation in the industry today, right? Of like why representation is so important, why especially BIPOC filmmakers, artists are speaking out and feel like they've been denied like this access, this sort of agency to tell their own story. And I think Bruce Lee is a perfect example. Like if Bruce Lee didn't have this random lucky coincidence happen, then we wouldn't have Bruce Lee, and where would we be now today? And so I think that was so important to, again, towards the themes of the film and the themes of Bruce Lee's life, that I had to include it.
It's yeah. Go ahead, Julia. It seems like you
No,
want
I
to.
was just going to say, from that historical context side of things, especially, when we have spoken to audiences after watching the film, I think that backdrop and of what was experienced by Asians in America and then Asian Americans, I think that historical context is so important to understand Bruce, the people around him, all of those things. And I think that's those were the two worlds that we really wanted to meet, because to meet in the film, because it gives you that context to understand.
Julia, can you talk a bit about the the way ESPN played a role here? Because technically, I know this is part of the 30 for 30 series, and the thing we're talking about a movie star, the entertainment industry. When we hear ESPN, we think sports. So, how do you see that context being relevant here?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I've made a few feature docs. You spend a lot of time, raising money and all of those things. And Bao and I had spoken about the film. We knew what the film was going to be. I knew roughly how much it was, going to cost. And we started to talk to, different funders about it. And I would say, ESPN, they had such an amazing reaction to Bao's pitch. He basically said, "I'm in." From, I think we only said we were only talking for about 2 minutes, and they were so supportive from day one of Bao's vision. They were so supportive of me as a producer on the project. It was my first project in my new company, which was a big thing. And they really were very filmmaker friendly. They kind of just trusted us so much. It was such a delight working with them. And they gave us all the resources we need, supported us editorially, really challenged us in the edit. But it was like a very collaborative challenge, if that makes sense, always trying to find the best version of Bao's film. And, for them, sports is more than what you just, see on ESPN as such. Sport is about competitism, athleticism. And for them, they saw the kind of the sporting ability of Bruce Lee, I suppose, from all the many different facets that he has. And we're in from day one.
So, Bao, I'm curious to hear a bit about what surprised you over the making of this film, because clearly you went into it with a lot of knowledge and enthusiasm for this subject matter. But as you researched it further and looked at other ways that this person has been sort of explored in the past, what caught you off guard?
For me, I didn't, I wasn't like this super fan of Bruce Lee. I think everyone's like, oh, you must have known everything about Bruce Lee. I was like, why am I making a film about him if I know everything already? So I always wanted to come in with it, obviously prepared doing the research, but really be open to the possibility of discovering and exploring the same way the audience would while watching the film. And I think Bruce Lee, again, has been a symbol of confidence, masculinity for so long, not just in the Asian American community, but I think all races, right? But from what I learned, talking again to the people who knew him quite intimately, is how sort of unsure and how much he had struggle and fears throughout his life. I mean, obviously, the story is also the story of an immigrant, right? And even though he was born in the United States, he sort of he grew up in Hong Kong and then came back to America. So those first few years where he came back to America in his late teens, early 20s, was really something that I didn't know as well as I thought I did. And in many ways, it was reflective of my parents' own journey. They were Vietnamese war refugees. They were in a refugee camp in Hong Kong and then came over to America also in their early 20s. And by learning about Bruce Lee, it made me actually want to learn more about my parents and their situation when they first arrived, because Bruce Lee had $100 in his pocket and he only had a connection to a family friend. And it was these people that he met that he was trying to teach that he learned so much about America. We often think about Bruce Lee as this, teacher of martial arts, this teacher of philosophy. We never think of him so much of a student of all the people he met. So especially his first student, Jesse Glover, African-American male, who was his first student, who approached him wanting to learn about Kung Fu because he wanted to defend himself against police brutality. I think having that become your first student really informs what you know of America and what you know of sort of race relations in so many ways. And also his relationship with his first American girlfriend, the Japanese American woman, Amy Sanbo. That conversation really opened things up in terms of like how Bruce Lee viewed identity, right? Because I think as any immigrant will know, and what they have to reconcile with is like how much do they bring of their own culture, their own nationality to this new homeland of theirs. And I think at that time in the early 60s, the idea of the Asian American was really starting to be prominent. And for someone like Bruce Lee, he always thought it was either or, that he had to be Asian or be American. And so that relationship, that idea of being both, I think, is indicative of how we, look at ourselves today as hyphenated Americans in so many ways.
The movie also feels like it's sort of a corrective to how Bruce Lee's sort of been this pop culture figure seen through the lens of his movies over the years. I was thinking about, the fact that you had this movie come out into the world after Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It stirred up conversations about, the depiction of Bruce Lee there. And it just seems like, in the wake of his passing every few years, there is some sort of resurgence of interest in Bruce Lee that's seen through, the fog of time and whatever filter the movies create. What do you think is sort of the biggest fallacy of kind of the canonization of Bruce Lee that, having made this movie, you're hoping to correct?
I think the idea that Bruce Lee was someone who just made it big in Hollywood based on his own merits, based on, being Bruce Lee, is something that we wanted to kind of deconstruct in so many ways. For me, it was that tragedy of Enter the Dragon coming out almost immediately after he dies, right? After his sudden death, that was so important. For the most part, I think people know that Bruce Lee died, but there's sort of this expectation in the story in many ways of like, okay, this is when he dies, right? There's no sense of tragedy, no sort of emotional connection to him. And one of the things that I wanted to do, again, is unravel and unpack the mythology of Bruce Lee. He's beyond him as a martial arts icon, beyond as a pop culture icon, that he was someone who, again, faced a lot of struggle, that had to go up against a system that wasn't ready for him. And it might be, some people might think that, oh, Hollywood is a very progressive system or progressive industry, but someone with, again, the charisma of Bruce Lee, with he was denied his full self, his stardom in many ways, his fame, because of where he came from and what he looked like. And so I think it's important that we constantly re-examine these sort of fallacies of Hollywood and of mythology and of heroic, American mythology, and what it means to be American. I think this year, given our outgoing president talking about the Wuhan flu and Wuhan virus, the China virus, the Kung flu, it's more important now than ever to talk about stories like Bruce Lee and show what Americans look like, that they don't just look like one type of person, one demographic, but they're all encompassing of this country. And I don't think this film and any documentary is definitive of any subject, right? I think as generations go on, we're constantly re-examining and reshaping and redefining what our stories and mythologies are. I think, as Bruce Lee said in the title of the film, Be Water, we have to be fluid. We have to not stick to rigidity and systems that we've been told over time, because that's what kind of stagnates progress in so many ways, and stagnates, I think, even us as filmmakers, as artists. We want to make the best type of art and stories and films we can. So I don't know why people are so hesitant to have uncomfortable conversations, because I think only great art comes from having these uncomfortable conversations.
Well, off of that, I'm curious to know how you think society or the industry, at least, has changed since Bruce Lee entered into it. Is there anyone out there you think who sort of embodies what he was trying to accomplish sort of at the height of his career, or is sort of carrying the baton in any particular way?
I mean, it's hard to sort of carry the baton of Bruce Lee in so many ways, right? I think what Bruce Lee didn't have when he was in Hollywood was really a huge community, right? A movement of people who are speaking up about representation, speaking up about like the importance of BIPOC stories. And one thing that has changed today, I think, is like a lot of people are speaking up, and a lot of people are willing to have these uncomfortable conversations. I think even someone like Bruce Lee, who obviously has very strong feelings, there's certain parts where he had to be a bit diplomatic in his thoughts and his opinions, because he knew that there weren't many opportunities for people who look like him. I think we need to, again, be willing to have uncomfortable conversations and open up. So I think, there's all different types of communities who are showing what it means to be represented, from the disabled community to, obviously all BIPOC communities. And we just sort of need to keep pushing things forward, instead of like thinking we should always be grateful for what we have. I think gratitude gets you so far, and then it becomes like, how do we create equity, right? True equity in the industry.
Off of your research, you spent a lot of time with Bruce Lee's filmography. I'm sure a lot of people who are sort of newbies will think of Enter the Dragon first and foremost, but is there a performance or a film that he was in that you think deserves more attention?
Well, there was a film that came out like, I know Julia's smiling because she knows what I'm going to say. There's a film that came out in Hong Kong. It was his last film before he moved to America, called The Orphan. And for me, it's so important to have it. His films when he was adult were great. But most of them are dubbed, and so you lack his voice in it. And Enter the Dragon is obviously his voice, but The Orphan is an example of film where you kind of see Bruce Lee became, and just right before he came to America, right while he was still, you can see all the charisma that he had, the performance, his stage presence, but it wasn't kind of veiled through the lens of Hollywood, right? And I think,
and I think also it was. Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, because especially if you know the blockbusters, yeah. We watched it. We were lucky enough to watch it when we went to Hong Kong, which I think, Bao, stop me if this is wrong, but you can only watch it in Hong Kong. There is no other way to watch the movie.
Yeah, that's the one caveat I should have said earlier.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah,
you can't find it here.
Well, no, it's not. I don't think there is no distribution, basically. It's, that's for a whole nother panel, films that have, don't have the distribution and the rights are tangled up. But it is the most wonderful film. And for me, especially, I think it is him. You can see he's taking his performance is very authentic, and it feels like of that time, he was having, potentially, some struggles himself. And I think you watch this film and you see a young man that is, you watch him and he is about to come to America, and, it's really special. So I recommend, if anyone is in Hong Kong, to go to the archives and watch this.
Make a mental note. Next time in Hong Kong, go to the archives.
It's fantastic.
It sounds fascinating. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. I feel like we could go another hour just talking about Bruce Lee and the big picture you got out of this, but the film does a lot of the talking for you. So congratulations on putting it together, and thanks again for being here.